trips, which meant no hotels, period. Not on the journey, and not after arriving in whatever town we picked previously. We drove a Subaru that had a decent amount of room in it, and we'd saved several $100s by just sleeping in it. This was my wife's method of curving our budget, and being an outdoorsman my entire life, I was on board from the moment. She mentioned camping. My wife, Kat, didn't have traditional camping in mind, though this was the early 2000s. So stealth camping wasn't quite as mainstream as it is now. Kat had heard about stealth camping from a co-worker who was a cross-country bicyclist. Her co-worker explained that while on these incredibly long pedaling trips, sometimes the only place to get safety and to get some rest is in a parking lot or the green belt between two businesses. Bikers would pack meager supplies, just enough to keep them going, and then supplement those supplies with whatever they could buy on the road. These bikers would carry light sleeping gear, maybe a tent or just a tarp, and rudimentary stuff like sun blinds or can openers to add a touch of convenience. So we'd start making this part of our Florida trips. We'd load up our Subaru with all kinds of odds and ends. Things that I imagine Boy Scouts would pack. Toothpicks, lighters, a rope, sandwich bags, and batteries. All the little things that you don't really think about until you need them. Everything would be filed away in a neat little stack, along with our bedding to make for a perfect traveling sleep capsule. Kat even had dangling drapes that encircled the back area for privacy. For the better part of 4 years, we had zero issues with our urban stealth camping. The only problem that we encountered was that many of these coastal towns that we were visiting had pretty good curfews and ordinances, so we couldn't overnight in beach parking lots or in front of stores or businesses of any kind. So we had to find places where people parked on the street, and again, for these small coastal towns in Florida, this wasn't a common occurrence. Everyone had a garage or a driveway, so our little Subaru camper stuck out like a sore thumb and never failed though. We would always find some little neighborhood or development where people did use the street. We blend in for a few days, maybe even a week, then hit the road for home. There were showers and facilities at the beach, all kinds of outdoor amenities. But the simple act of just finding a place to shack up for the night that always proved to be the most difficult. Camping in plain sight actually takes a little bit more creativity than folks give us credit for. During one particular trip, we were having an impossible time trying to find a place to set up. It was our first night in town, and by this point in the evening, we've been driving in circles through the community for 3 hours with absolutely no luck on an inconspicuous place to park. Finally, though, after following some windy roads that took us through a more rural neighborhood, we found a little stretch between the beach and some houses where people did park on the road. We pulled in on one end, where the neighborhood stopped and the road snaked off into the dark, and called it home. We started on our usual bedtime routines, like brushing our teeth, washing our faces out of the water, getting comfy, locking the doors, and snuggling in for bed. There was a commotion outside, though, as we heard walking around and a little talking. Soon someone was climbing into the car that was parked nearest to us, maybe 250 feet behind us, far away enough that we weren't really concerned. They fire up the car and roll off down the lane, only to leave us behind, pretty much alone out there on the street. There was now only one other car parked on the roadway, and it was hundreds of feet behind us. I was worried that they'd be leaving any minute now. Getting a ticket wasn't really in our budget. Kat and I discussed our options, but we were kinda trapped. After driving all day, only to drive even more around town, we didn't have it in us to start the car and look for a more populated area. As we were talking, though, our prayers were answered. On the front windshield, we could see a pair of headlights cut up the road the opposite direction and stop somewhere ahead of us. I climbed up and pulled the curtains back, only to find a big dusty van parked about 75 feet off. The second I saw it, though, I got this weird feeling from the bottom of my feet to the top of my throat. Something was off, and I let my wife know immediately. She popped up herself, took one look at it, and then got back under the covers. It was creepy, but we were in the middle of a neighborhood, and that was the whole point. We were safe and needed to be incognito, not be suspicious and draw attention to any passing vehicle. She was right, and frankly, I admired her for her undaunted courage, but I didn't like the van nor how close it was to us. From my place behind the curtain, I watched someone fire up a cigarette in the driver's seat of the van and proceed to smoke it while looking right at our car. I couldn't do it. I told Kat that I was going to sit watch for a bit because everything was just a little creepy. She said whatever, rolled over, and then promptly passed out. I slithered up into the front seat and got comfy behind the wheel. We were parked against the moon and had a decent tent. I was wearing dark clothing, kind of a perfect storm for not being seen behind the windshield. The whole time I just watched this hand go back and forth with the cherry of the cigarette. No smoke escaped the window, not even a whisper. Anyone smoking with the windows up is a total psycho, if you ask me. That being said, my paranoia was now at an all-time high, and to this day, I've never been so suspicious of a person. But I couldn't let it rest. After 30 or 40 minutes of just staring that van down, I finally decided that I was going to go for the long haul. I'd see the sunrise if I had to. Whatever it took to make sure this guy went away. I got the jet boil, the percolator, everything I would need to make a quick, quiet pot of coffee. I set the whole thing up outside the car, on the ground, on the passenger side, so I could stay somewhat hidden from anyone driving by or looking out from their window. I also wanted to force the action. I got tired of watching that van and waiting for something to happen. So I got out and essentially offered a challenge to anyone that wanted to mess with us. Here I am out in the open, no tricks to be pulled. I watched the night sky, listened to the heat whirring beside me, and then I heard the click and slam of a car door opening and closing. I look over, and there's that guy from the van, awkwardly staring at me across that 75-foot gap. And then almost immediately, he starts walking right toward me, one hand in his pocket. He didn't seem panicked or intimidating or anything, just the energy of a man running an errand. I, on the other hand, was low-key tripping out just underneath my skin. This was what I wanted to happen with my open challenge to the world, right? But now he was coming over. I realized that I bit off a little more than I can chew, and now I was about to choke. I took a deep breath just before he got within earshot, reminded myself that everything was fine. I had a 14-inch Bowie knife laying in the dirt beside me, something my wife and I traveled with everywhere we went. I was going to use it, hopefully to scare this guy off at the first sign of trouble, and if not, very soon. In his chest before he could kill me or my wife. He gets within 25 feet and just stands there, more of that awkward energy. The more the guy does, the more strange that he seems. His hands go in and out of his pockets. He pushes his hair back a few times and then finally comes over, within talking distance. He says hello and asks me, "How's it going?" We share some very brief small talk before you ask me for some matches. The only matches that we had are in the car, but I do have a lighter for the jet boil, so I hand it over and explain that he can just keep it. He seems blown away by this, like he's never received a kinder act of generosity. Continues to thank me over and over again. After a string of thank yous comes to a final end, it goes back to just awkwardly standing there. That's when it occurs to me how big this dude is. 6'2" at the very least. He's broad too, a well-built fella. But it was so dark that his dimensions were hard to discern at first. Now that I sized him up, I was a little uncomfortable again. His awkwardness came off as apprehension, like maybe he was about to jump me or something. You better believe that I had that knife tucked in my waistband just underneath my shirt. It was still in the sheath, so honestly, it would have been a pain to get out and use, but having it close was relieving. I poured 2 cups of coffee in the disposable throwaway cups that me and my wife used. I offered up one to the guy. I told him that I was staying awake for a bit, for a photography shot, as I was an amateur photographer. This part was actually true, but there wasn't any shot that I was looking for. This was just an up and down lie, short of the being an amateur photographer part. That's about the time that this guy decided to dive into his backstory. The stranger told me his name, something I still don't remember, and that he'd very recently been released from prison. He was moving along the coastline on his way to Miami, where he had a job lined up. I nodded along, more interested than you could believe. I could have easily earned an Academy Award with the performance